this was the reward. The silence. The peace I'd earned with 2.5 decades of noise and violence. But in the gray pre-dawn light, I saw something that didn't belong. A flicker of unnatural movement. My eyes were doing the work before my brain even registered the threat, slicing through the haze, cataloging a column of figures advancing from the tree line. 8 of them. They moved with the clumsy arrogance of men who've never faced return fire, bunching up, gear clattering softly against itself. Amateurs playing soldier. I didn't move. I raised the ceramic mug to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. They were trying for tactical, but their execution was a joke. Their spacing was wrong, their silhouettes were obvious, and their gear was fresh out of the box. Too clean. They breached the outer fence line, not with precision, but with brute force, snapping a wire post with a loud crack that echoed across the valley. It was a sound that made my German shepherd, a dog who'd slept through thunderstorms, lift his head with a low growl from inside the house. I just gave a soft whistle, and he went silent. He knew the drill. Stand by. They formed a sloppy semicircle at the base of my porch steps, weapons held at a low ready that looked more awkward than intimidating. 7 of them were dressed in black tactical vests and ill-fitting khaki pants. The 8th man, their leader, was a study in contradictions. He was maybe 60, with a full head of silver hair and a soft, privileged face. He wore the same tactical vest as his men, but underneath it was a crisp pastel blue polo shirt, tucked neatly into his chinos. He was a country club commander, and he was sweating, even in the cold. He held a clipboard like a shield, its pages protected by a laminated sheet that caught the first hint of morning light. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "John Callahan?" he asked, his voice trying for authority but cracking with nerves. I just stared at him over the rim of my mug. I didn't confirm my name. He was on my property. He already knew. He took my silence as a challenge, puffing out his chest. "I am Arthur Pennington, president of the Oak Valley Historical Preservation Homeowners Association," he announced, as if the title held the weight of a federal appointment. "We have an emergency seizure warrant for this property." He brandished the laminated piece of paper like it was a scepter. I let my eyes drift down to it. It was a work of fiction masquerading as law. The county seal was a low-resolution JPEG, slightly pixelated at the edges. The legal font was Times New Roman, and the violation cited was a masterpiece of bureaucratic nonsense. "Pursuant to subsection 9B," he read, his voice gaining a smug confidence, "regarding aquifer contamination protocols, your property is in gross violation. We are authorized to seize all assets pending a full compliance review." My gaze swept over his hired guns. One was shifting, his weight from foot to foot, his rifle discipline non-existent. Another was staring up at the roof of my barn, distracted. They were a collection of weekend warriors and ex-cops who couldn't cut it, all playing a part for a paycheck. They were a liability, not a threat. I brought my eyes back to Pennington. He was expecting an argument. He was expecting fear. He was expecting me to fold, just like every other landowner he'd rolled over in this valley. But what Arthur Pennington didn't know was who he was talking to. He hadn't just trespassed on a ranch. He had breached the perimeter of a man who spent 25 years planning for days exactly like this one. He saw a retired veteran on a porch. He had no idea he was looking at a retired SEAL Master Chief who saw every tactical flaw, every angle, every weakness in his pathetic little army. I finally lowered my mug, the silence stretching until it was taut. I looked at his fake warrant, at his nervous soldiers, and then locked my eyes onto his. And I gave him my answer. "You brought the wrong men," I said, my voice low and flat, cutting through the morning air like a blade. "To the wrong fight. On the wrong day." He blinked, his smug mask faltering. He opened his mouth to reply, to assert the power of his clipboard, but no words came out. Because he finally saw it in my eyes. He wasn't looking at a target. He was looking at a predator. They thought this was an execution of a warrant, a simple land seizure. They believed they held all the cards, that their numbers and their cheap tactical gear gave them the authority to take what was mine. They came here to set a trap, confident in their plan. They never once considered that they had just walked, single file, into my kill zone. This whole mess didn't start this morning with a fake warrant. It started months ago, with a polite offer, a hidden agenda, and a secret buried deep in the bedrock beneath my feet. A secret they were willing to spill blood to own, and now they were about to find out just how high a price they would have to pay for trying to take it from me. To understand how we reached that cold dawn on my porch, with a fake commander and his toy soldiers standing in my kill zone, you have to understand the ground they were fighting on. You have to understand who they were dealing with. My story isn't written in boardrooms or on legal pads. It was written in the sand of the Hindu Kush, the jungles of South America, and the forgotten hostile corners of the world where American interests were defended not by diplomats, but by men like me. I am a retired Navy SEAL Master Chief. For 25 years, my job was simple: execute the mission. My specialty wasn't just kicking down doors or high-altitude insertions, though I did my share. My expertise was unconventional warfare and infrastructure security. I didn't just learn how to break things. My real value was in understanding how complex systems function: insurgent networks, enemy, supply lines, national power grids, and how to protect them or dismantle them with surgical precision. When I retired, I didn't hang it all up. The mission just changed. I came back home with a thirst for silence, but my skill set was too valuable to put on a shelf. The offers came in, not from private military contractors, but from the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA. The battlefield just changed. Instead of mapping terrorist cells, I was mapping vulnerabilities in the nation's critical infrastructure. I designed security protocols for hydroelectric dams, whose failure could wipe out entire towns. I advised on how to harden the electrical grid against sophisticated cyber attacks. I wrote the playbook on how to protect strategic reservoirs during national emergencies. My job was to see the threat before it materialized, to think like the enemy, and to build defenses they could never breach. That's what I did for the country. And this ranch, this piece of land I bought with my own blood and sweat, was where I did it for myself. This place wasn't just a home. It was a fortress of solitude, a working model of the principles I preached. 120 acres of defensible terrain, with a single access road that I controlled. The house is positioned with clear fields of fire. I have my own well, solar power with battery backup, and enough supplies to last 6 months without ever seeing another human being. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparedness. It was the mindset of a man who knows that the peace is always temporary, and the only security you truly have is the security you build yourself. But I wasn't some hermit, walled off from the world. I was part of the valley. When a wildfire swept through the North Ridge 2 summers ago, it was me and my tractor cutting a fire break that saved the Miller and Sanchez properties. When the drought of 2022 nearly bankrupted 3 families, I used my knowledge of hydrology and old survey maps to help them tap a new aquifer on their land. I was the quiet man on the hill, the one you called when the problem was too big for anyone else. They respected me, and I respected them. It was a simple, unspoken contract. That contract, that peace, was built on a foundation of rock and water. And it was an old friend who first warned me about the water. His name was Martinez, a geologist who'd forgotten more about this valley than most people ever knew. He'd helped me survey the property when I first bought it. One afternoon, sitting on this very porch, he pointed with a gnarled finger toward the creek that cut through the south pasture. "That little stream of yours, John," he'd said, his voice raspy. "That's not just water. That's a ghost. It's fed by the oldest spring in this county, and the charter attached to it was the first one ever filed in this state, back in 1888. He leaned in closer, his eyes serious. "That piece of paper makes your water rights almost absolute. It predates the state, the county, every modern law. It's a legal right so old and so powerful, it's like owning a piece of the bedrock itself. A lot of powerful people have forgotten it exists. Don't you ever let them remember?" He was right. It was a ghost, a legal anomaly from a forgotten time that gave me almost total control over the source of this valley's aquifer. And a year ago, someone remembered. Arthur Pennington. He didn't arrive with men and fake warrants, not at first. He arrived in a brand new Mercedes, wearing a blazer and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He introduced himself as the head of a new community initiative, the Oak Valley Historical Preservation, HOA. He talked about shared values, about protecting the valley from outside developers, about maintaining our unique cultural heritage. It was a polished, professional pitch, the kind designed to soothe and disarm. Then, after 30 minutes of empty platitudes, he got to the point. He said my creek, with its unregulated runoff, was a potential threat to the valley's historical purity. He said his HOA, on behalf of the community, was prepared to solve that problem for me. They would buy my water rights, not the land, just the rights. He slid a cashier's check across my porch table. It was for $10,000. I looked at the check, an amount that was a profound insult. He wasn't trying to make a deal. He was testing me. He was probing for weakness, assuming I was just another dumb, ignorant rancher who didn't know the value of what he had. He thought he could steal $1 million asset for the price of a used car. I didn't get angry. I didn't even raise my voice. I just slid the check back across the table. "The water stays," I said. Pennington's smile finally vanished. For a split second, I saw the predator behind the mask. He saw he wasn't dealing with a farmer. He was dealing with a wall. He stood up, his polite facade crumbling into cold fury. "You are making a mistake," he hissed. "This is a community matter now, and this community protects itself." I just watched him walk back to his luxury car, a man completely insulated from the consequences of his actions. He thought he was declaring war. All he had done was confirm the identity of the enemy. That was the day the polite mask came off. That was the day I started preparing for the real fight. Because I knew men like him. They don't give up. They just escalate. I knew men like Arthur Pennington. I'd seen them operate in failed states and developing nations. They were warlords in $1,000 suits. Their weapons weren't rifles. They were lawyers, bylaws, and political favors. Their battlefield was the fine print in a contract and the whispered promise in a backroom deal. So after he left my ranch, I began my own reconnaissance. I wasn't just defending my property anymore. I was mapping an enemy network. And at the center of that network was the Oak Valley Historical Preservation HOA. It wasn't a homeowners association. It was a perfectly legal weapon, a corporate entity with teeth, designed for one purpose: to seize assets. Pennington, with his silver hair, his feigned passion for local history, and his deep city money, had crafted it to be the perfect tool of conquest. He wasn't a president. He was the CEO of a hostile takeover firm disguised as a community group. His method was a slow, grinding form of psychological and financial warfare. He didn't need guns, not at first. He used the system itself to bleed his targets dry. I started digging into the county records, and the pattern was undeniable. His first victims were the Garcias, an elderly couple whose family had worked their land for 50 years. Pennington's HOA sued them because the shade of red on their historic barn wasn't on his newly invented, approved historical palette. They fought him for a year, draining their life savings on legal fees until they were forced to declare bankruptcy. The HOA then placed a lien on their property and bought it at auction for pennies on the dollar. They didn't just lose their home, they lost their entire legacy over the color of a barn. Next was the Young family. Pennington fined them into oblivion for using modern wire fencing for their cattle instead of period-appropriate wood fencing. He buried them in citations, legal threats, and daily harassment from his so-called compliance officers until they broke, selling him the land for a fraction of its worth just to escape the nightmare he had created. But Pennington wasn't working alone. A hunter like that needs a support structure. His political cover came from County Commissioner Henderson, a man whose campaign coffers had been mysteriously filled by a series of anonymous donations from a community improvement fund that I traced back to a shell corporation owned by Pennington. Henderson was the one who rubber-stamped Pennington's zoning challenges, who fast-tracked his lawsuits, and who made sure any complaints against the HOA got lost in a sea of bureaucratic red tape. And once a property was foreclosed on, or the owners were forced to sell, a single buyer always emerged, a company called Apex Development. A quick search revealed Apex as a subsidiary of the same shell corporation. The entire operation was a closed, self-sustaining loop of corruption. Pennington was the hunter who targeted and weakened the prey. Henderson was the tracker who legitimized the hunt. And Apex Development was the butcher who processed the kill. With me, they followed the same playbook. The first wave of the assault was paper. An endless barrage of letters from a high-priced law firm in the city, each one a carefully worded threat wrapped in legal jargon. Then came the official filings. A notice of a property lien, citing my refusal to cooperate on community water standards. A zoning complaint filed with Henderson's office, claiming my tool shed, a structure that had stood for 40 years, was an unpermitted agricultural building that violated the valley's historical aesthetic. I countered every move. I responded to every letter, citing state and federal property laws that superseded their pathetic bylaws. I filed a counter-complaint on the lien, providing my property's original charter, which proved their HOA had zero jurisdiction. But it was a war of attrition. They knew it. They were trying to drain my time, my focus, and my resources, hoping I would make a mistake or simply grow tired of the fight. When the paper war failed to break me, Pennington escalated to direct intimidation. He hired a private security firm staffed by washed-up ex-cops and military rejects. They became his compliance officers, a private army of thugs in polo shirts and cheap nylon vests. They couldn't legally set foot on my property, so they used presence as a weapon. A black SUV would park on the county road 100 yards from my gate, sitting there for hours, its tinted windows hiding the men inside. They would patrol the public trails bordering my land, always visible, always watching. It was a classic psychological operations tactic, designed to create a constant low-level state of anxiety to make me feel besieged in my own home. They wanted me to react, to get angry, to do something rash that they could then use against me. But they were probing a fortress. All they found was stone-cold silence. I spent my nights not in fear, but in research. I spread a topographical map of the entire valley across my kitchen table and began to mark the locations of the properties Pennington had seized. The Garcia Ranch, the Young Farm, 3 other smaller parcels he'd squeezed out. A clear, undeniable pattern emerged. The properties weren't random. They all sat directly above the same underground aquifer. They were all connected to the same network of streams and springs that originated on one place, and one place only: my land. He wasn't trying to preserve history. He was trying to conquer a watershed. That's when I finally understood the true scale of his operation. This was never about the color of a barn or the style of a fence. It was a scorched earth campaign to consolidate and control the single most valuable resource in the entire region: the water. With that much water under his control, he could get the county to rezone the entire valley for a massive, high-density development project. A project Apex Development was no doubt ready to build. I was the last piece on the board. My land, with its ironclad, century-old water rights, was the key to the entire kingdom. I was the only thing standing between Pennington and total control of the valley's future. And now I knew, with absolute certainty, that his next move wouldn't be a letter or a lawsuit. It would be a direct assault. The time for defense was over. It was time to hunt the hunter. Pennington thought he was fighting a rancher. He was about to find out he was fighting an intelligence officer. After I uncovered his pattern of land acquisition, the game changed. My ranch was no longer a home to be defended. It was an operating base. I wasn't waiting for his next move anymore. I was dismantling his entire operation from the inside out, piece by technical piece. His war was one of paper and influence, so I decided to drown him in it. I started building a target package on Arthur Pennington, the kind I used to build on warlords and terrorist financiers. It began not with a weapon, but with a trip to the state capitol. I descended into the sub-basement of the state archives, a climate-controlled tomb filled with the ghosts of forgotten contracts and broken promises. I spent 2 days surrounded by brittle paper and the smell of old leather, pulling every deed, charter, and geological survey map associated with the Oak Valley from the last 150 years. And there, in a dusty folio, I found it. The original 1888 water rights charter for my property. The elegant, hand-drawn script on the yellowed parchment was more than just a legal document. It was a declaration of sovereignty. It granted my land's owner, in perpetuity, first and absolute rights to the spring and all its tributaries, a right that, as Martinez had said, predated almost every other law on the state's books. It was a silver bullet. With the foundation of my legal standing confirmed, I moved on to his corporate structure. Pennington was careful, but no one is invisible in the digital age. I started with Apex Development, the company that always seemed to profit from the misery his HOA created. Public records showed it was owned by another company, a holding firm called Valley Heritage Investments. On paper, Valley Heritage was clean, registered to a law office in the city. But corporate filings are a trail of digital breadcrumbs, and I followed them through 3 states and 4 different shell corporations, each one a deeper layer of legal obfuscation designed to hide the true owner. It was a classic money laundering setup, intended to make the flow of capital untraceable. But they made a mistake. In one of the filings for a shell company based in Delaware, they'd listed a former director. A simple background check on that name led me to her social media, which was filled with pictures of her at charity galas, standing next to her new boss. In the end, all roads led back to the beginning. The sole director of the final parent corporation, the entity at the very top of this pyramid of lies, was one Elizabeth Pennington. It was a family business. Arthur provided the muscle, his wife hid the money. Now that I had the man and the motive, I needed to understand the true scale of his endgame. And that's where my past and present converged. As a FEMA consultant, I have high-level clearance to access certain federal databases. One of them is the National Infrastructure Protection Database, or NIPD. It's a dry, sterile government system that catalogs every piece of infrastructure deemed critical to national and regional security. It's not something you can just Google. Two-factor authentication, a data use agreement I had to digitally sign, and then I was in. I ran a query on the GPS coordinates of my property. The system churned for a moment, and then a result appeared that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My spring, the same one Pennington was trying to steal for $10,000, was officially designated as a strategic emergency reservoir. In the event of a catastrophic drought or a disaster that compromised the municipal water supply for the entire region, my ranch was a designated federal asset, a last resort to provide clean water to 100,000 people. The designation had been classified in 2015, and the file noted that it had been deliberately redacted from all public-facing county and state servers to prevent panic or targeting. This changed everything. Pennington wasn't just engaged in a land grab anymore. He was actively conspiring to seize a federally protected strategic asset. The fines, the fake violations, the harassment, it was all part of a sophisticated campaign to force me to sell a resource whose true value was a matter of national security. And the fact that this information was hidden meant that someone on the inside, likely his puppet Commissioner Henderson, had helped him bury it. I now had proof of a federal crime. But I needed one more piece. I needed to hear it from his own mouth. Technology can be a weapon, and I had my own arsenal. I acquired a high-gain parabolic listening device, a piece of equipment that could capture a conversation from 500 yards away. The law is very clear on surveillance, and I followed it to the letter. I positioned the device on a ridge at the extreme southern edge of my property, aimed not at a private residence, but at the public county road that ran past my gate. The same road Pennington's security chief, a thick-necked brute named Cutler, used as a nightly staging point. I waited. For 3 nights, nothing but wind and the sound of passing cars. But on the 4th night, I hit the jackpot. Pennington's Mercedes pulled up alongside Cutler's SUV. I hit record. The audio was clean, the conversation chillingly clear. Cutler was giving a report. "He's not reacting," he said, his voice a low grumble. "The pressure isn't working. He's either stupid or he's fearless." Pennington's voice was sharp, impatient. "He's not stupid. He's a relic, a man who thinks because he fought in some forgotten war, the rules don't apply to him." There was a rustle of paper. "The investors are getting nervous. We need that water allocation secured for Apex Phase 2, and we need it done by the end of the quarter. The raid is scheduled for Friday at dawn. I want you to present the warrant and give him one last chance to sign the transfer deed. No negotiations. He takes the final offer, or you seize the property." Then Cutler asked the question that sealed Pennington's fate. "And if the raid doesn't convince him to sign?" There was a long pause. When Pennington spoke again, his voice was stripped of all its civilized polish. It was cold, flat, and utterly ruthless. "Then it's no longer a real estate issue, is it? It becomes a security issue, and you will be authorized to solve that security issue by any means necessary. The project is insured against complications." I leaned back in my chair, the recording playing on a loop in my headphones. Any means necessary, final solution, complications. He had just confessed. He had just admitted his raid was a sham, and he had just authorized my execution. He thought he was planning an attack. He had no idea I had just gathered all the evidence I needed to burn his entire world to the ground. The game was over. All that was left was the final move. The silence on my porch stretched for 3 heartbeats after I spoke. Arthur Pennington stared at me, his face a mask of confusion. The script in his head, the one where the simple rancher either argues, pleads, or crumbles in fear, had just been ripped to shreds. He was expecting a gunfight. What he got was a system. My system. He opened his mouth, a pathetic attempt to reassert the authority of his clipboard, but he was too late. My thumb, which had been resting on the side of my coffee mug, depressed a small, flush-mounted button. It was a simple, quiet movement, but it initiated a sequence that was anything but. He thought this was his raid. He was about to become a participant in my drill. The first sound wasn't an explosion. It was a series of sharp hisses from the ground. Hidden sprinkler heads, the same kind you'd see on a suburban lawn, popped up in a pre-planned grid around the base of my porch and driveway. But they didn't spray water. They ejected a fine mist of a viscous, foul-smelling liquid that coated Pennington and his entire team from the chest down. One of his men yelled out, thinking it was some kind of chemical agent, but the truth was far more elegant. It was a non-toxic, industrial-grade marking agent, loaded with a dye that was nearly invisible in daylight, but glowed a sickening, radioactive green under ultraviolet light. It was a dye I used to track wildlife migrations for the Forestry Service. It was also impossible to wash off. It bonded with fabric and skin for weeks. In that single, silent hiss, they were no longer an anonymous security force. They were marked men. Every one of them tagged, catalogued, and identifiable to anyone with a cheap black light. Their vehicle, parked 100 feet away, was now wearing the same invisible stain. Pennington sputtered, wiping at his polo shirt in disgust. "What is this?" he shrieked. "This is assault." Before he could finish his tirade, the second phase of the system engaged. From 4 concealed points on the eaves of my barn and house, a sound began. It wasn't a siren. It was a low frequency, oscillating, pulse that you felt deep in your bones before you even heard it. It's a sonic deterrent, designed not to deafen, but to disrupt. The specific frequency attacks the vestibular system in the inner ear, the part of the body that controls balance. It induces profound vertigo, nausea, and an overwhelming sense of panic. It dismantles a person's ability to think, to coordinate, to even stand upright. The effect on Pennington's team was instantaneous and catastrophic. Their discipline, already a joke, evaporated. The man who had been fidgeting dropped his rifle and clutched his head, his eyes squeezed shut. Another stumbled sideways like a drunk, crashing into his teammate. A third doubled over and vomited onto the gravel. Pennington himself staggered back, his face pale, one hand clamped over his ear, the other flailing for balance. His raid had devolved into a pathetic, disorganized rout in less than 30 seconds, and I hadn't even raised my voice. He was screaming orders, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive, vibrating air. They were broken, and it was into this carefully orchestrated chaos that the real law arrived. The piercing, familiar wail of a county sheriff's siren cut through the low-frequency hum. The flashing red and blue lights painted the scene in strobes of official, undeniable authority. A single squad car roared up my driveway and skidded to a halt, blocking Pennington's escape route. Right behind it, a white news van from the local TV station screeched to a stop, its cameraman jumping out before the vehicle had even stopped rolling. The bright, harsh glare of a camera light ignited, illuminating Pennington's panicked, sweat-streaked face for the entire world to see. His private war was suddenly very, very public. The deputy who stepped out of the cruiser was a man I knew well, a straight-arrow cop named Miller. He took in the scene with a practiced, calm eye. The stumbling, disoriented men covered in a strange liquid. The composed man on the porch sipping coffee. The silver-haired civilian in the middle of it all, looking like his world was ending. Miller unholstered his weapon, but kept it pointed at the ground. He walked past Pennington as if he wasn't even there, and stopped at the foot of my steps. He nodded, his expression a mixture of grim professionalism and something that looked like respect. "John," he said, his voice carrying easily over the now fading sonic pulse. "I got your call 30 minutes ago. Figured I'd give you a head start. I see you're handling your own site security assessment." The casual, professional tone of that one sentence sucked all the remaining fight out of Pennington. The color drained from his face. He stared at me, then at Miller, the horrifying calculus of his miscalculation finally dawning on him. Miller turned his attention to Pennington, and his friendly demeanor evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard mask of authority. "Arthur Pennington," he said, his voice like ice. "I believe you are the president of the so-called Historical Preservation HOA." Pennington, flustered, tried to regain control. "Deputy," he stammered, brandishing his pathetic, dye-stained warrant. "This man is in violation. We were acting within our rights." "Turn it off, Arthur," Miller commanded, taking a step toward him. "Your rights end where federal law begins." He gestured with his chin toward me. "You see this man? You think he's just some retired old soldier. Let me tell you who he is. This is John Callahan, a lead infrastructure security consultant for the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA. And this ranch, this land you and your band of fake cops just tried to raid? It's not just a ranch. As of 2015, it contains a federally classified strategic asset." The reporter was scribbling furiously, her cameraman zooming in on Pennington's collapsing face. Miller wasn't finished. He took another step, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You didn't just commit trespass, you arrogant son of a bitch. You just conducted a hostile action against a piece of critical national infrastructure. You have no idea the world of trouble you just brought down on yourself." Miller snatched the clipboard from Pennington's limp hand and snapped it over his knee, the crack echoing like a gunshot. "Put your hands behind your back," he ordered. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Pennington's wrists, the defeated man stared at me, his eyes filled with a venomous, impotent rage. This wasn't the look of a man who was beaten. It was the look of a cornered snake. "This changes nothing," he snarled, his voice a hoarse whisper as Miller pushed him toward the squad car. "You think this stops me? My lawyers will have this thrown out in a week. The project is already funded. You haven't won anything. He was wrong. I hadn't won anything. I had just won everything. He thought his money and his lawyers were his true power. He was about to find out that I was going to war not just with a lawsuit, but with the full, crushing weight of the federal government. His project wasn't just funded. It was finished." Arthur Pennington shouted about his lawyers from the back of a squad car, a desperate final act of a king whose castle was already on fire. He still believed he was in a legal fight, a battle that could be won by the men with the most expensive suits and the dirtiest tricks. He had no idea that I wasn't filing a lawsuit. I was executing a kill chain. His threat about the project being funded was the last gasp of an enemy who couldn't comprehend the war had already been lost. He thought he was facing a hearing. He was about to find out I was dropping the equivalent of a MOAB on his entire corporate structure. My retaliation wasn't a single legal filing. It was 3 synchronized strikes, delivered in the space of 1 hour from the laptop on my kitchen table, aimed at the 3 pillars of his empire: his corporate legitimacy, his environmental, impunity, and his operational security. The first strike targeted the man himself. I compiled every piece of evidence I had gathered: the century-old water charter, the web of shell corporations leading to his wife, the surveillance photos of his intimidation tactics, and the crown jewel, the crystal-clear audio recording of him authorizing my elimination, into a single, encrypted digital file. I sent it not to the local district attorney, but directly to the state attorney general's office with a subject line that read, "Evidence of racketeering, conspiracy, and fraud in Oak Valley." A RICO case isn't a slap on the wrist. It's a legal declaration that your entire life is a criminal enterprise. It meant every part of his operation, the HOA, Apex Development, his network of holding companies, was no longer seen as separate legal entities, but as a single coordinated conspiracy to defraud the citizens of the state. The AG's office responded in 6 hours. They weren't just opening an investigation, they were impaneling a grand jury. Pennington's corporate veil, the legal shield he'd used to terrorize people for years, had just been pierced. The second strike targeted his motivation: the water. My report to the Environmental Protection Agency was a masterpiece of cold, hard facts. I attached the original 1888 charter, my property's official designation as a strategic emergency reservoir from the FEMA database, and a detailed analysis of the Apex Development proposal, showing how its water consumption would irreversibly drain the aquifer within 10 years. The EPA doesn't negotiate on assets of national importance. They don't issue warnings. They act. They immediately filed an emergency federal injunction against the HOA and Apex Development, freezing all operations that could remotely impact the watershed. With that injunction came the fines. The EPA has the power to levy penalties that can bankrupt a small country. Pennington's fraudulent little HOA was now facing a fine of $50,000 a day, retroactive to the date of their first complaint against me, for conspiring to seize and compromise a federally protected water source. His project wasn't just on hold. It was now a financial black hole, hemorrhaging cash with every tick of the clock. The third and final strike was personal. It was an expert talking to other experts. I didn't just send an email. I logged into the DHS network and filed a formal after-action report directly with my contacts at the National Infrastructure Advisory Council. My report, titled "Hostile Action Against a Critical Domestic Asset by a Coordinated Non-State Entity," detailed every aspect of the raid. I attached the personnel files of Cutler's security firm, the schematics of their sloppy tactical approach, and my analysis of their intent. I wasn't a civilian complaining about trespassers anymore. I was a federal consultant reporting a direct and deliberate breach of national security protocols. That report triggered a response that local law enforcement could only dream of. 2 days later, a pair of quiet, serious men in dark suits from the FBI's Infrastructure Protection Division showed up at the county courthouse. They didn't come to ask questions. They came with federal warrants. They froze every bank account associated with Pennington, his wife, Apex Development, and the HOA. Every dollar he had was now locked away as evidence in a federal investigation. The collapse was a beautiful, cascading failure. It was the result I had seen a dozen times in my career when you successfully remove the center of gravity from an enemy organization. The banks, seeing the federal freeze, immediately called in their loans to Apex Development. The construction contractors, facing massive penalties for breaking the EPA injunction, declared breach of contract and sued Pennington for damages. County Commissioner Henderson, named as a person of interest in the RICO case, held a tearful press conference where he announced his immediate retirement due to health reasons, publicly denouncing the rogue actions of his former friend. Pennington's allies didn't just abandon him, they ran from him like he was a plague. His empire wasn't a fortress. It was a house of cards built on bribery and intimidation, and I had just kicked out the foundation. I thought that was the end. But men like Pennington, men who have never known failure, don't break. They shatter. I got a call late one night from Deputy Miller. His voice was grim. "John, you need to be aware," he said. Pennington made bail. His city lawyers found a friendly judge and pulled a rabbit out of a hat. He's out. I was silent, processing. "That's not the part that worries me," Miller continued. "We got a tip from one of Cutler's guys, one of the security guards looking to cut a deal. Pennington isn't skipping town. He's unhinged. He cleaned out his business account for cash right before the freeze hit, and he spent it on a dozen 55-gallon drums of industrial solvent. I knew exactly what that meant. He wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to burn the whole board. If he couldn't have the water, he was going to make sure no one could. He was going to poison the spring, salting the earth in a final nihilistic act of revenge. And I knew, with the cold certainty of a combat veteran, that he was coming back to my land one last time. He was coming to finish the mission. And so was I. Miller's call wasn't a warning. It was a confirmation. The final piece of intelligence in a long and brutal campaign. I hung up the phone, not with a sense of dread, but with a sense of profound finality. The enemy was broken. His supply lines were cut. His command structure was in ruins, but he was still making one last desperate charge. This was the endgame. Pennington was no longer a corporate predator. He was a wounded animal, driven by pure rage, and that made him predictable. I didn't reinforce my house. The house was no longer the objective. The spring was. So I spent the next 24 hours preparing the ground. I coordinated with Miller, who looped in the state police. This was no longer a county matter. It was an active federal case, and we were about to close it. I placed a series of my own motion-sensitive night vision cameras in the trees overlooking the creek, feeding a live signal directly to my tablet and to a state police command vehicle parked 2 miles down the road. I did not arm myself. My weapons in this fight had always been strategy and information, and the final act would be no different. They came 2 nights later, just after 2 a.m. 3 figures moving through the darkness with a desperate, clumsy urgency. I watched them on my tablet from a concealed observation point in my barn loft. Pennington was in the lead, a man consumed by a madness born of utter defeat. Behind him, 2 of Cutler's last loyal thugs struggled with 55-gallon drums of what I knew was a toxic industrial solvent. They were following the creek bed, heading directly for the source, for the heart of the valley. They moved like ghosts through the night, convinced they were unseen, unaware they were walking into a perfectly prepared kill box, their every move being watched, recorded, and broadcast. They reached the clearing where the spring bubbled up from the earth, the very place Martinez had called the valley's soul. Pennington barked a hoarse order, and his men began to pry the lids from the drums. He was about to commit an act of irreversible evil, to poison the water for generations, all to spite the one man he couldn't break. That was as far as he got. With a single tap on my tablet, I gave the signal. A bank of stadium-grade floodlights I had rigged in the trees ignited, bathing the entire clearing in a sterile, unforgiving noon. The 3 men recoiled, blinded and exposed. Before they could even process what was happening, a voice boomed through the trees from a loudspeaker. "State Police, do not move!" From the darkness, a dozen figures in the heavy tactical gear of a state police SWAT team emerged, weapons raised, laser sights painting red dots on the chests of Pennington and his men. It was over before it even began. There were no shots fired, no heroic struggle. Just the overwhelming, irresistible force of a perfectly executed trap. I watched on the screen as Pennington's face, illuminated in the harsh glare, cycled through shock, disbelief, and finally, the empty, hollowed-out expression of a man who has truly lost everything. He fell to his knees in the mud, a king in a court of his own ruin. He wasn't just arrested for trespassing or conspiracy this time. The charge, announced in a press conference the next day, was environmental terrorism. A federal offense with a penalty so severe he would never see the outside of a prison wall again. The rest of his empire crumbled to dust. The HOA was forcibly dissolved by the State Attorney General. Apex Development, with its assets frozen and its principals facing RICO charges, declared bankruptcy within a week. The Garcia's children and the Young family joined a class action lawsuit that would strip Elizabeth Pennington of every last dollar she had tried to hide. The war was over. A month later, I stood in the Oak Valley Community Hall. The room was packed with the same neighbors who, just weeks before, had been too scared to make eye contact with me. Now their faces were filled with a gratitude that was humbling. I'm not a man who is comfortable with speeches, but I knew I had one last mission to complete. I stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd. There are people who will try to tell you that power comes from money or from a title on a clipboard, I said, my voice steady. They're wrong. Real power is the willingness to protect what is yours. This valley, and the water that gives it life, is yours. I held up a legal document. The settlement from the state was significant. I have used it to place my land's water rights into a newly formed entity, the Oak Valley Community Trust, an ironclad legal structure owned by every resident here that will ensure no one can ever use our water as a weapon against us again. This water doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the valley. My job was just to stop the thieves. Tonight, I am back on my porch. The sun is setting, painting the sky in colors of orange and purple. The air is still, filled only with the sound of crickets and the soft sigh of the wind through the trees. The silence has returned. But it's different now. It's not just the absence of conflict. It's the presence of a deep, profound, and earned peace. Max rests his head on my boot, his tail thumping a slow, steady rhythm against the wood. The war is over. The perimeter is secure. My mission is complete. They came here looking for a resource to exploit. They saw an old rancher on a quiet piece of land. They forgot to check who was guarding it.